Our next speaker is Dr. Dave Franzen. He's a professor and extension soil scientist at North Dakota State University. He holds a master's and PhD degrees from the University of Illinois. A major part of his work has been to provide educational programs on soil and soil fertility topics. He is recognized expert regarding the evaluation and use of effective nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors. And this section of the conference we'll be talking about specifically crop production. So we'll talk about some of the things that Dave is doing, and then we'll talk about manure, we'll talk about nitrogen management with irrigation, and that will take us to lunch. David?
Okay, thanks a lot. All right, so this is kind of the subject that I've talked most about for the last 6 months, I guess. So I want to leave it a bunch of points, and number one point is that these organisms that are commercially available now weren't invented 2 years ago. That they're very, very ancient things, some of the oldest organisms on Earth. They're not associated with a plant like a rhizobium, bacteria, bradyrhizobium, or anything for peas or lentils or any legume. They're just free living in the soil, and they take atmospheric nitrogen and transform it into ammonia, fixing it. And so there's evidence of these things as much as 1.5 billion years ago. So that's remarkable, considering that the symbiotic organisms, as we're most familiar with, only came on the scene maybe 60 million years ago. To understand the limitations of them is that the conversion of nitrogen gas to ammonia is a very energy-intensive process. An energy-intensive process in a plant or organisms is to make the peptide bond, to make an amino acid hook onto another amino acid to make a protein, and that takes roughly 5 ATPs. If you remember your biochemistry or your organic chemistry, biochemistry, or plant physiology, the ATP to ADP is the energy transfer. It's one of the energy transfer things within a cell that makes things work. So the energy is really limiting the nitrogen fixation. Compared to that peptide bond synthesis, it takes over 3 times the energy to split that triple bond of the N2 gas, a very strong bond. All right, so another thing I think is interesting, but I'm kind of a nerd, is that the nitrogenase enzyme, which of course had to be around 1.5 billion years ago, contains 7 iron atoms. And that's unusual, because if you look at most enzymes that are in plants, animals today, they might be one central metal, but here we have 7, and it's just really interesting, because 1.5 billion years ago there was no oxygen, and so in the atmosphere, and so iron was completely soluble in everywhere. That's why the ancient rocks are very often orange or red or something like that, because once there was oxygen, it just kind of fell out of the solution. 7 iron. So I just think that's interesting, and that's just nerdy me. All right, so the energy sources that these things feed on are number one, root exudates. If you pull up a plant in the summertime and feel the roots, you'll feel it's moist, but it's not water. It's the slime that comes out of the roots. Roots are very leaky. You take a 200 bushel corn crop, it's probably during its lifetime in the field, it's lost maybe 1,000 pounds of whatever out of the roots. And there's thousands of different organisms that feed on this. It's what we call the rhizosphere. It's one of the reasons why we use that name, is there are many things living around the roots because the roots are leaky, and it's a source of food. They also may get it from soil organic matter or from residue breakdown. There are also some compounds that I haven't looked at hardly at all, except to test them, and they actually live inside the plant tissue, not symbiotically, but they're just living there. So they have to get energy from someplace. It kind of makes you wonder if they're taking carbohydrates out to make ammonia. Those carbohydrates aren't going into natural plant metabolism. It's just kind of an odd deal. So if you look at some micrographs of this, where the arrows are, it points to roots that are just covered with this this slime, these root exudates. So that's a food source. There's a lot of diversity. A recent paper showed that just in one soil sample in China / Tibet, the 6 phyla, which is, large groups of within an organism, and then 13 classes, 43 genera, and then all those species that are underneath there. So there's like hundreds of these things. So it's not a mystery to me that there's any number of companies, maybe 100 companies, maybe more than that now. Any chemical company on Earth has probably got some kind of a biological that they're putting in a container. There's plenty to go around. So there's lots of these kinds of things. All right. So not going to get into a lot of this, but in North Dakota, my recommendations are the only ones on Earth, on the universe, that has a nitrogen credit for 6 years or more, no-till, continuous no-till. I got the idea from long-term no-tillers back in '95 on the coldest day of my life, 45 below in Minot, North Dakota, which is very, very different winter than this one. And they said that they just didn't follow NDSU recommendations anymore, that after a no-till, they figured they could shave the nitrogen rates. And some of them in the room had been in there for more than 20 years, no-till, and they found that the recommendations just didn't resemble ours at all, didn't pay any attention to it. So I like, okay. So then when I gathered, well over 100 site years of nitrogen rate studies on spring wheat in Durham, I remembered the conversation, split it, and yeah, it amounted to about 50 pounds of N less to get at least the same wheat yield and at least the same protein as a conventional till. And so it's been in our recommendations, and then in corn, and then in sunflowers, and most recently in two-row malting barley. I deliberately put in long-term sites and tested that, whether it was different, and it was in every case, about 50 pounds of N. So it's a thing, and I always thought it came from the increased number of microbes and the increased number of kinds of microbes that are in the soil. Because at planting time, the crop isn't taking up nitrogen, but the microbes are. They like ammonia. They don't really particularly like nitrate, but they love ammonia. And so when you put on ammonia fertilizer, they take some up. And so I just figured it was protected. Then I was in a meeting like this with Jody DeYoung Hughes. Gosh, how long has it been? 10, 15 years ago, probably. And some person in the audience raised their hand and said, well, what about asymbiotic nitrogen fixers? And I just kind of poo-pooed it. I'm sorry I did. If you're in the room, I apologize. Because I'd read the literature and it was like 5–10 pounds of N, and I told the person that that's just the background N. It's why if you don't put any nitrogen on, you don't get zero yield. There's a nitrogen that comes from the soil, and part of it is from this natural asymbiotic bacteria population, and I just left it at that, and then it just kept gnawing at me. I said, well, okay, so those studies were conventional till soils where they beat the soil to death all the time, and so they destroyed their food and destroyed their housing. And so, but what about these no-till sites that you don't destroy their housing and they have plenty of food to eat? What about those? So I did paired studies and found that there was a lot more nitrogen fixation by asymbiotic bacteria under this than there was under conventional till. So I figure maybe 25–33% of that comes from that. So this is a chart. Everything to the right of the vertical line in the middle are sites where the activity in the no-till is higher than conventional till. And the farther to the right you go, the more it is. And the two in the middle, the no-till farmer I talked to that talked to me about, in his mind, the conventional neighbor was actually a no-tiller too. They were just doing shallow one-pass seeding instead of a classic no-till, but that means no-till equals no-till, which should be pretty intuitive. So that's what I found. And then the next thing I wanted to know was how does the activity change during the season? Because I couldn't find anywhere where that was the case. If you look at mineralization bacteria, they're most active right after the thaw till about middle of June or something like that, and then activity goes way down. So that's mineralization. Do these things act the same way or not? And so I had 6 sites in eastern North Dakota, and I looked at them every month during non-frozen periods for 3 years, and I found that it was very, very they were very, very sensitive to amount of moisture before my sampling dates, and they were very sensitive to temperature. So moist but not saturated, and certainly not droughty. And warm, uh, maximize their activity. So the figure on the right is from a site west of Fargo, about 100 miles. And that's how most of the sites looked like in most years. The magnitude of of those numbers changed a lot. We had one year that was very droughty, and so the shape of the curve was the same, but the activity was way lower than what you see right there. And then the one on the right, the Gardner one, the one with the dip in it, that's because when I walked out there at the date where the dip is, I had to take off my boots and wade out there with my bare feet, because that's a high clay soil where the movement of water through it is only maybe a third of an inch a day downward. And so the site where I wasn't flooded, but it was certainly saturated with water. And saturation, as you see, can really decrease the amount of activity. It bounced back, but at the time of saturation, the activity was very low. So this summarizes what I know about native activity. They're much greater in long-term no-till because you don't destroy their food and housing, and they like moist soil and warm conditions, and they don't like drought, and they don't like to be saturated, and they don't work very well when it's frozen. So that brings us to commercial products. Fabian is Fabian's not a member. Dan Kaiser is a member of the Ag Experiment Station Committee on Non-Conventional Additives and Amendments. And it's been around, that committee's been around for June and Christmas, 40 years or so, well before I came. And so we met in November, as we always meet after a conference. And the chatter in November of 21 was all about these things. And so there were a couple people in the room that had done some work on it, but almost everybody in the room, not everybody, but almost everybody in the room, were going to work on it in that next spring in 2022. So we decided as a group that we would pool our results when we got together again in November 22, and that I would volunteer to put the information together and send it out to them for reviews, so I wouldn't misrepresent what they sent me. And then I volunteered NDSU to publish it in a publication. So we did. So these are the four products basically that we tested on corn, Invita and Nutricia and Proven and Proven 40. The Proven was the 2021 product, as I recall. It had one organism in it, and then Proven 40 was the 2022 material. So anyway, if you go to my website, just Dave Franzen, NDSU, choose the extension publications, and then in there's a publication in the last couple of years about asymbiotic organism activity, something like that. And so you can read all the methods, you can see all the charts, you can see everything from the 10 states that supplied information to complete that publication. And I'm not going to go through it because it's just boring. So, but at the end, I'll show you what's going on at the end, and that's really what's important. So that there were 54 total corn experiments from the 10 states. 52 of them had no benefit to yield over using the product with the N rate alone. There were 2 that had benefits with N rate, and if you did the calculation, it amounted to somewhere around 12 to 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre year. So the end result was that the frequency of positive responses was very low. Just leave it at that. That's all I'm going to say. So then what do we do with that kind of information? So I think the first thing is, and you heard a little bit about that this morning in a presentation, is you need to be skeptical about new products. I think it's intensely really, really important for people, for consultants and for farmers to be curious about new products, but on the same hand, just walking out of a steak dinner and signing up for 10,000 acres of product that you've never looked at is not smart. Let's just leave it at that. So it's not smart. So try them on replicated strips across the field. Just take a deep breath. If the products are really going to be really, really useful, then they're going to be around next year too. So try them on replicated strips. So I'm going to refer to the person this morning. Of course, the information is great, except I differ with him on his check strip, and I'll show you that in a minute. But anyway, Refer to Laura Thompson, 2022, from the proceedings of the North Central Extension Industry Soil Fertility Conference. That's what the first page looks like. She's the director of the University of Nebraska Extension On-Farm Research Network. So if you go to cropwatch.unl, if you Google that, you'll find their webpage is great. It has tutorials, YouTube tutorials about how to set up experiments. I'll show you, they have a really nice tutorial on the most simple statistical program you'll ever see in your entire life. So there is an example from the paper, just some images about how to set these things up. And the upper left there is a multi-rate nitrogen rate experiment. I don't expect anybody to do that, and I'm not sure that I would ask anybody to do that unless they're really comfortable with this kind of thing. But certainly the without replicated strips, really the way to go. That's how you should do it. So then controls. So if you're testing a product supposed to give you more nitrogen, would you put the product on at that rate where the arrow is? If you did, what would you know? You would know nothing, because you're already where you're supposed to be. Doesn't this make more sense? So in an example this morning, it was 120 pounds of N as urea across the whole field. Is that smart? I mean, that's where you're supposed to be anyway, right? So have your applicator, or if you're putting it on yourself, you do your strips at 60 with and without. If it's going to do anything, that's where you're going to see it. You're not going to see it up at the top. Just not. So you need to keep that in mind when you do it. You don't have to use 0, but you need to use something way down the line from where the peak is. All right, so there's the website, cropwatch.unl.edu. That's it right there. So, and then FarmStat right underneath it has a tutorial. This is so simple. Your 5-year-old could do this. And if your 85-year-old mother-in-law lives with you, she could do this. It is that simple. I mean, the 5-year-old just kind of a slam dunk. Of course they're gonna, but 85, if my mom, 91, I don't know, she has trouble turning on her computer. But if she was 85, I think she could do it. So farmers have GPS, so they can put out these treatments, and they have GPS yield monitors. Farmers have everything they need in order to replicate treatments and to test these products effectively. And so that's point number 2. Point number 1 was these things are natural in our system, and they're providing nitrogen already. Whether they're doing it as well as selected ones can, I don't know. But they've been around for a long time. So they're not you're not putting them into a vacuum. They're already there. So one of the great things about actually being the lead author on this publication, even though I only had 4 sites that I was leading out of the 54, is that quite a few startup companies have contacted me. I've had probably six startup companies contacted me early last summer. 1 from the UK, 5 from California. One actually from Berkeley actually sent some people out to Fargo to talk to me over the desk. So they were really interested. The reason why they made contact was, in their words, were they didn't want to have a train wreck. So we talked about lots of things, and so the next points I'm going to give you are points that came out of that discussion. And a lot of these are ideas that they have that I didn't really think about. There has to be some kind of a quick method of analysis where you can really take a little sample of the soil of the plant and really find out if they're actually there and alive and actually doing something. There has to be something like that. I think this is possible. My colleague Barney Geddes, who's a microbiologist who does a lot of stuff with soil out of NDSU, has worked out ways that they can actually extract the organisms, or at least figure them out somehow through magic of biotech, and isolate different things so you can tell if they're alive or not. So this should be question number 1. Person comes in, I got this product, it's supposed to do this, it's a biological. Can I have a test kit to test if it's actually doing something? If you get a deer in the headlights look, just offer him a cup of coffee, talk about the weather, and then see him out the door. All right, point number 4, these are all important points, but this is something I think that really needs to be considered. So the organisms need to be kept alive through the transportation and storage intervals, manufacturer, shipper, warehouses, distributor, dealer on the farm, waiting application. So those are the 2 products that I tested and my colleagues tested in North Dakota. Those are the storage and disposal and handling on the label. That's what they look like. So the one on the top, and I can't even remember which one is which. But their directions are store at room temperature and do not subject to temperatures below 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Second one, store between 39 and 46. Okay, is 39 to 46, is that room temperature? Even my wife turns the thermostat higher than that. 58's not out of sight. She probably has it turned down to 60 right now with me left. But anyway, that's not room temperature, is it? And so it's a very narrow, some of these products have very narrow specifications. And so this is really important, not only for you that are going to get to the field, but actually from the very, very beginning. So one of the companies that was most concerned about this was actually the one from the UK that we zoomed in on, that they zoomed with me. They had the money was there, the main scientist was there, 3 postdocs were there, and one of the postdocs asked this. She said that they know that when the container leaves the manufacturing, that the organism is alive. But she says, we don't know after that. And so that's especially a problem if you're overseas, because you're either on an airplane that's, calibrated to make sure that the poodle that it's also transporting is getting over to New York in good shape. Um, but if you're on a container, which is more likely, um, I've actually seen containers go through Fargo that were refrigerated, and I was surprised because I'd never seen one before, and I've never seen one since. But if you're in the container, there needs to be power to it so that it keeps them refrigerated at whatever temperature these things are supposed to do. And then it has to continue onto the ship. And then it has to continue over to the port. And then it has to continue up in the dock waiting for the longshoremen to get rid of their get done with their strike in order to put it on a truck, which is also refrigerated, to take it to the distributor, who also has a huge Tajma tool shed that's environmentally controlled so that the stuff will stay alive during the 2 months that it sits in the distributor, and then it goes on a refrigerated truck from the distributor. Have you ever seen one of those? I don't know. Maybe I've been out of the business for too long. Maybe a refrigerated truck to take to the retailer, who also has part of his tool shed set up environmentally controlled to put forklifts in and out of these things, and then finally to the farm. The farmer comes in and says, I'm going to plant my 5,000 acres of corn this week. So you send it out to the farm, and of course the farmer has a climate controlled area, and then it rains, and instead of being able to put it on in the next week or so, it takes another 2 weeks, and the temperature is up and it's down and up and down and all that. So it's not a trivial thing. So ask about the distribution network. Ask about where it has to, because if you kill it, it ain't gonna work, is it? All right, so this is not trivial either. I mentioned briefly the slime, the rhizosphere, that there's thousands of things living on this root already. And then you're gonna stick something else into it, either a seed treatment or some kind of a starter application or whatever. It has to be able to compete with this. Those organisms that are around their root are going to defend their space vigorously, and other things are going to want to eat you. And so it needs to be able to survive and to compete with things that are already there in order to be helpful. Another thing that Barney Geddes is working on, because some of the more aggressive, competitive organisms that you could buy for, say, inoculating the soybeans do not tend to be the most gracious with their nitrogen production. And the things that are the wimpiest tend to be the things that are the greatest nitrogen fixers. And so there's things that nobody has really ever looked at before, but this needs to be looked at. How competitive really are they? And then maybe it's not quite so important here, but in North Dakota, it's extremely important. So we have soils that have salts. We have soils that don't have salts. We have soils that have carbonates. We have soils that don't have carbonates. We have acid soils down to in the low fives maybe that you haven't looked at for a while that need to be limed, but they just maybe next year. And then you have pHs up around 8 or something like that. And then you have sandy soils and you have clay soils and you have droughty soils and you have wet soils. And I know in North Dakota, very commonly, a person that have quarter section with everything I just mentioned all in the same field. Are these things competitive? Are these things adapted to work in that whole environment? Because you're counting on them to do that. But are they really tested in all those environments to really know if they're really going to work or not? Another question to ask. And so those are questions to ask, and none of them are very trivial things to do. So with that, I'll kind of leave time for questions if there's any, but that's what I'm going to leave you. These products are going to change all the time. They're already changed. And so just because we found that they did work, didn't work, whatever worked, really the burden of efficacy is on the farmer, and you need to be willing to do the replicated trial. One last story. Time for a little story? Time for a little story. Got a call this fall from a grower up in northwest North Dakota. And he said he'd heard me talk sometime and about replicated strups. And so the winter before, last winter, he had maybe half a dozen salesmen come to him, and there were 5 products in particular that he was really interested in. 3 were products he had to put on pre-plant, and 2 were foliar fertilizer products that he put on in season. And he said so he picked a field for 5 different products, one for each of the 5 products, and he put out replicated trials. And I was pretty amazed because I don't know what it was like down here, but last spring was horrible. It was wet, it was cold. People didn't get in till late May, and especially northwest North Dakota. Holy cow! But he stayed the course. He said, it took a little bit more time, but I really wanted to know what was going on. So he put the trials out. The foliar ones weren't near as much of a problem, but it's still, a little bit of a pain to do replication. But he had his GPS and he had a GPS combine. So he combined them, he ran the stats, and he says, I'm just so frustrated. And I said, why? And he said, well, none of the products I used were any different than what I was doing before. And I just started laughing. I said, do you have any idea how much money you saved? You saved those thousands of dollars, and now you know that the products really aren't of value to you, so you're going to see thousands of dollars well into the future. And then any kind of adjustments and management you might have used in order to use those products, you don't have to do that. And he says, well, yeah, I guess I did. So that's how you know. That's the only way that you're going to know. So anyway, no more stories.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Let's give him a hand. All right. So the first question is about CU credits. We will have this slide kind of rotating during the break, and also outside at the registration table, there are QR codes there where you can scan it to get that. Dave, first question, the N credit for long-term no-till, how widespread is in geographic extent might that credit exist?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the long-term no-till credit, how geographically? So certainly within the state boundaries of North Dakota, magically at the Red River, everything changes. And I know that's not the case, but I will say that because, Dan Kaiser in his wisdom has told people before that our corn system includes a lot of sites from northwest Minnesota. But I'll just share with you that maybe there's one no-till site in that whole data set. So it's not really much. So I can't really compare what's going on the east side of the river. I just don't know. And I don't know about in South Dakota, which you don't care about anyway, you know, or, so, but in the state boundaries of North Dakota, surely it is. And all soil fertility is local. I firmly believe that. And I spent my first career in Central Illinois, I can tell you, is Central Illinois very different than what it is up here. It just is. I mean, yeah, we grow corn and soybeans, but it's just very different. It's just very different. Climate, soils, the whole system is different. And so I would never take my recommendations that I found here in the state of North Dakota and try to impose them anywhere else, unless they had data that supported their use. And so I'm sorry, if you have a farm in North Dakota, you're good to go. If not, it's, you know, replicated on-farm testing would be a way to figure out if that was the case or not.
Good. Next question is, how do any of these N-Fixer products have USDA certification?
Yeah, so do any of these N-Fixer products have USDA certification? And I do not know, and I kind of hope they don't right now.
Next one is, do you think the GMO corn varieties affected the activity of bacteria?
Yeah, so the question was GMO varieties, did they affect it? I don't know. I know that I think all of the I'd be shocked if anybody within the system hadn't used some kind of a GMO. But have we tested without? I just don't know. I don't know.
Would warmer areas like southern Minnesota have more N available in no-till situations?
Well, Dan's going to be up here later on. I'll hold that question for you. And how do we measure acetylene reduction in the field? You don't. And that's the problem. John Lamb actually was the first paper that I could find when he was a PhD student in Nebraska. They did a study on long-term no-till versus conventional till on one of the research farms with his advisors. And he has a paper in Soil Science Society American Journal, which I'd missed when I was writing my paper because I used asymbiotic and they used non-symbiotic in their title. So I missed it. But they decided that it really wasn't that much and that it really wasn't all that important. So they were thinking it was a quantitative measurement. But what you're doing is you're taking that beautiful no-till soil and you're taking a trowel and you're taking it out of the soil. And as to paraphrase Obi-Wan in the Star Wars, it was like a trillion voices all cried out at once and were immediately silenced. So they're in their happy homes where they've been in there for a decade, and all of a sudden somebody destroys them, you know, with some kind of an earthquake, and then you ship them out to someplace because you can't do this in the field. You can't. And so I shipped them down to a colleague down at University of Florida in Gainesville, and they did the analysis down there. And so the measurement that I have is a qualitative measurement, which I compared back to that 5 to 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre from the previous papers from the conventional till, and that's where I got mine. And I have all this in the paper. I didn't try to pull wool out of everybody, but you don't do this in the field. Unfortunately, you just can't. You just can't.
One more question about no-till N credit in Manitoba.
Yeah, so I don't know about that either, and you lost John Hurd, so I don't know where you guys are right now. I'm going to be at the Crop Connect conference tomorrow, and maybe Don Flayton, who's also going to be up there. Maybe I'll see John Hurd up there. Maybe you could corner him in the corner and ask him if he could come back from retirement and answer that.
Very good. Well, let's give Dave a hand.